Fantastic. Hi, everybody. As I stated before, my name is Joe Van Allen. My title is Assistant Director of Career and Professional Development for the College of Natural Sciences. And I'm going to be speaking to you today about this concept of taking your resume next level. So that's why we call this next level resume writing. I'm imagining that most of you folks probably have a resume. And if you don't, we're going to talk about some of the basics as well. But what we're going to be moving into in this session is talking about the theory behind resumes, helping you understand what a resume is supposed to be. And that way, rather than just following rules that you've heard before or things that you're supposed to do, you can sort of unlock the potential of making your resume work for you specifically. I did state this earlier. If you have any questions during the course of the presentation, please feel free to use the chat. I have the chat window open right up on the side here, and so I should be able to catch those questions as they come in. Or if you think your question might get answered later on in the presentation, feel free to save it towards the end. We'll have a minute for you to unmute, ask your questions, or toss them into the chat. So feel free to jot them down or put them in the chat right now. So why don't we go ahead and get started? All right. So a quick introduction to our office. So our office is called the Career and Professional Development Center for the College of Natural Sciences. And we have 4 wonderful staff members that work here. Actually, one of them is joining us on the call today. This is actually her second day. I have not updated this slide yet, but Marilyn Silverstein is also here. Thank you for that, yes. So we have this wonderful team that's here to help you with all sorts of things. So in addition to doing presentations like the one that you're attending right now, we also do one-on-one meetings where we can talk about resumes and cover letters and anything related to your careers. If you have questions about those things, I'd encourage you to visit our office earlier rather than later. If you're thinking about upgrading your resume, trying to change it around, making it a little bit more customized to your experience, we would be happy to see you. And the way that you can go and arrange a meeting with us is through this website called Handshake. You all already have access to this website just by the fact that you're UMass students. I'm guessing you've all logged in, because if you were getting the contact info for this meeting, then you probably had to log into Handshake at some point. But in case there's some way that you're sitting here with a friend or something like that, and you haven't used Handshake before, you can access it by going to this website, umass.joinhandshake.com. and then get a lot of information, including ways to find internships, ways to book appointments with your career counselors, the folks that we introduced on that previous slide, and then finding out about a lot of other information that's available. If you are in that place where you're looking for a little bit more to read and understand about what might go into a resume, you can also visit our website. So that's right there at the bottom, cns.umass.edu/careers. And all of the resources that we typically share with students are sitting out on that website as well. So if you're in a place where you feel like you might not be ready to meet with an advisor, even though we're happy to see you, no matter what your preparation level is, you can visit that website and you're going to find a lot of the resources that are going to be most useful to you. So let's jump into the presentation for today. So one of the things that I like defining for folks right away, especially inside of the College of Natural Sciences, is defining the difference between these two terms that you're going to see used fairly interchangeably, but they are two extremely different things. And that's this idea of a resume and a CV. So resume, assuming you all have heard that before because you're attending this meeting, this workshop, so at the very least you've seen it in that context before. But the word resume is actually a French word, and it means summary. And a resume is typically meant to be a summarization of your skills and experience. You're most often going to use resumes when you apply for jobs, and as a result of a resume being something that is meant to be a summary of your experience, it does tend to be a little bit on the shorter side. Most of the time you're going to hear that a resume should be 1 page, sometimes 2 pages is appropriate depending on where you're applying. And you're going to pick any experience that you have that could be related to that job. So a lot of times you're going to expect that you might put your work experiences, if you ever did an internship related to what you're doing, or if you worked at Dunkin' Donuts like I did, like any of those kinds of work experiences, if they're going to be relevant, they're going to show up on that document. Now compare that to a CV. So CV stands for curriculum vitae, which is Latin for course of life or study of life, depending on what translation that you're using. And this tends to be a much more comprehensive document that only covers specific types of experience. And that specific experience is usually stuff directly related to your academic field of study. As a result, if you were to borrow a CV from one of your professors, you're going to be receiving this monstrous document that's probably 8, 10, 20, 50 pages long that has a collection of everything that they've ever published, every class that they've ever taught. And it's because they've concentrated in their field so specifically, they have a lot of experiences that would tie into that. As opposed to what your CV would probably look like, which is it's going to be a little bit shorter because you are in the beginning of the academic focus of your career. You might hear these terms used interchangeably, especially if you're applying for job positions in laboratory settings, because they see both of these kinds of documents. At this point in your career, even if you're going to be creating a CV, it's going to be a little bit more of a resume CV hybrid. And so while this presentation is meant to focus on resumes exclusively, you'll probably be able to take some of the tips and tricks you learn and apply them to creating a CV as well. I would say if you're ever in a situation where you do have to create a CV, I'd probably recommend making a meeting with somebody in the Career Center. We can sort of help you shape the resume experience that you have into something that's a little bit more appropriate in a CV context. Okay? Fantastic. Let's move forward. So we're going to be focusing on resumes more exclusively during the course of this presentation. So I wanted to show you 2 resumes just to start things off. These are 2 sample resumes. You can find them on our website. They're inside of our handbook, so don't feel the need to write things down or screen cap these necessarily. You can find these. But I wanted to show you 2 resumes that we share out with students. And the reason that I want you to do that is, despite the fact that these are both examples of resumes that we hand out, you can see that they are fairly different. They're using different kinds of fonts. There are different sections in between the 2 of them. And if you put them side by side to each other, while you can find some commonalities, they both talk about education, there's some kind of experience sections in both of these, there are way more differences than there are similarities. And this starting point of talking about next level resumes or resume 2.0 is recognizing everything that you've heard about templates or what you're supposed to do with a resume. We're going to be trying to break that away. We're going to try to tear those things down and get to a point where you're creating something that you are picking and choosing those rules that you've heard in the past. Only the ones that really make sense for you. And if you're finding rules that don't seem to make sense or conflicting with what you think might be right, then we can eschew those things. We can go and push those things off to the side and focus on just the ones that work for us. So I asked earlier, what are some rules that resumes are supposed to follow? And typically we see a lot of different things from people because there's a lot of different sources of information. You hear this like resumes are supposed to be a page long. Sometimes you hear that they're supposed to be printed on fancy paper. A lot of times you hear that there's a specific font that you're supposed to use, like Times New Roman is the only way to go. For those of you who don't know, this slide is written in what we call a serif font. Serif fonts like Times New Roman have like the little markers on the edge. So a T is normally like this, but serif fonts have like the little edges on the T, right? Sans serif fonts are the ones that tend to be a little bit more straightforward. So if you're looking at the font that Zoom is using for our names, those are sans serif fonts. So sometimes you hear you're supposed to use only serif, and sometimes you're supposed to only use sans serif. Sometimes people say never put a picture on there. Sometimes people say a picture is supposed to be on there, but there's a lot of conflicting information, and that I find to be a bit of a struggle. I know when I was first trying to write my resume out, like professional resume when I was in college, I was getting really frustrated because there was a lot of conflicting information. And so what I'm going to say is, instead of calling these rules, we're going to call all this information guidelines. These are helpful things to know about. So if somebody tells you one of these things, I don't want you to be like, no, I know that's wrong. It could be right, and it probably has been right for some people, but it might not be specifically right for you. So what we're going to do is start at the base of what a resume needs to be, the only actual rules, because they are the definition of what a resume is, and then use that to help build out and customize what your resume can be. So for those of you who don't know me, my background was originally as a recruiter. I've worked inside of human resources and recruitment for about 7 years, and I've been a career counselor for the last 8. And through the literally hundreds of thousands of resumes I've read at this point, I've only found 2 unbreakable rules through all of the resumes that I've ever read. Good resumes tend to live inside of these rules really well, and less effective resumes tend to be breaking these rules, and it's what's making them not work. And I feel comfortable calling these rules because, like I said before, they are basically the definition of what a resume has to be. Remember before I said a resume is a summary, and these are the two rules that will make you effectively summarize your experience. We're going to go into a lot of detail about both of these, but this should be your major takeaway, these two rules. So our first rule is going to be to focus on this idea of relevance. We want to share information about your experience that's going to be relevant for the position that you're applying for. This also means you might be tweaking your resume from one job to another because those positions might have different experiences that you are trying to relate to. So the first thing is to think about this idea of relevance. I don't want you to use relevance as a gate to keep information off your resume. I want you to use this term as a way to give yourself permission to put it on your resume. So I mentioned earlier, this almost always comes up in my resume conversations, that I used to work at Dunkin' Donuts. Statistically, I'm looking, we have about 20 people on the call. I bet if all of you were from New England, there's at least one other person who's worked at Dunkin' Donuts as well. It's just one of those jobs that shows up fairly frequently. And on its surface, I mentioned I worked in human resources as a recruiter and now as a career counselor. If I were to ask folks whether or not Dunkin' Donuts is a relevant experience to what I'm doing right now, most people would probably say no. Because if you think about what people do at Dunkin' Donuts, they make coffee, they put food together and stuff like that. It doesn't feel like it's directly related. But if you went and started talking about that job in a different way, mind you, this isn't me trying to make this job sound better. It's just true what it is. I had to deal with conflict constantly in that job. I often had to start relationships with people I had never met before. These conversations of, hi there, welcome to Dunkin', how can I help you? These spontaneous interactions. Those are both things that I do on a day-to-day basis in my current job. So what you're going to find is everything you've ever done is going to be a relevant experience because it defines you. What we're going to try to do is have you pick your most relevant experiences and then talk about them in a way that makes it for the person who's reading your resume and makes it easy for them to understand why that experience would be relevant. Number one, relevance, our most important rule, okay? Even beats out rule number two. Number one is relevance. So rule number two, I say it in the easiest possible way to understand. But what we're really talking about here is accessibility. We want your information to be easy for people to understand. And there's tips and tricks for how to do this. A part of what's going to help us make it easy for people to understand is to think about how we write our sentences. And so that goes back into our relevance piece. We're going to try to help the people who are reading our resume understand why this is relevant. So we want to come up with ways to say this information so it's easily accessible to the person. But it also has a lot to do with the formatting of the document. What information are we putting on here, and are we saying it in a way that people can easily read through your resume? For a little stat, something that gets thrown around, the average resume gets read the first time through within about 30 seconds to 2 minutes. That first draft, that first pass, the person reading it is really only going to spend about 30 seconds to 2 minutes reading that document. It's going to be more of a scan than something in depth. And as a result, this accessibility portion ends up being incredibly important because you want to make it so that if somebody's only going to spend 30 seconds reading your resume, that they can read more information from it. Making this document more accessible and easier to read is going to make it so that they learn more about you. Okay. Now, if I only gave you two rules, this presentation would end really quickly. So we're going to be talking about those rules and then giving you some more customized guidelines to help you fulfill those rules. There's going to be times where you might find reasons not to follow these guidelines, and that's okay. That's why we call them guidelines. The rules are the first two, but the guidelines are just things that will often help you get to where you need to be. So guideline number one is this idea of brevity. At the end of the day, your resume is going to be a shorter document than you probably want it to be. You're going to probably wish that you could say more information, but we're going to save that more in-depth information for cover letters or interviews potentially. Here, we're looking for brevity that will catch people's attention. A good way to catch folks' attention is by getting to the details of what you've done. A lot of times details are something like giving out numbers. So rather than just saying that you worked with kids, you might say, I worked with children ages 9 to 14. Those numbers, even though they don't take up a lot of space, they're going to give important context as to the nature of your work. So rather than just saying I worked with kids, well, the difference between working with 9 to 14-year-olds is going to be way different than if you were working with 3 to 5-year-olds. So adding in these little figures makes it easier for people to envision what your work is or what work you've done. and how it might connect to this position. Sometimes it's numbers, sometimes it's examples, sometimes it's accomplishments, but usually this idea of getting to details and specificity is going to make it easier for people to understand your past experience. Finally, consistency. When you are creating your document, you don't want to be changing formatting around too often. If you have certain things that are big font, something small, font sizes are changing, colors are moving around, it's going to be really hard for people to absorb that information because their brain's always going to be wondering, why did this change? Why is this different? Having some consistency in your document is the number one thing that will make it easier and quicker for people to read. Sometimes all I'll do on somebody's resume is make the document more consistent and then hand it to them. And almost without fail, they look at me and go, wow, this is so much better now. It's not better because I did anything. Literally didn't even change a word on it. But when you present it consistently, it looks more professional. It looks cleaner. So it's something to think about there. I want to dig into these a little bit more in depth. So as I stated here, if you are thinking about like pulling some information away from this, maybe screen cap this one. But let's get into a little bit more depth as to what I mean about each of these rules, these important guidelines or important rules for us to follow from the beginning. So the first thing that I talked about was relevance. Relevance is going to be changing the way that you talk about your experience so that somebody who isn't you can understand what it is. Now, a lot of times I meet with students who, let's say that you're a biology major. Any given class year of biology students at UMass has like 300 or 400 folks. Their instinct is often to talk about their biology experience very briefly. They're like, I've been in these massive classes for so long. Everybody knows what it means to be a biology major, so I'm going to talk about it really briefly. But the people who are outside of UMass might not know what that means. Even somebody who, a biology major who graduated 5 years ago, isn't having the same experience that you are having right now. And the way you engage with your coursework, the other things that you do is going to set you apart. So don't be afraid to talk about your experiences as if they are special and unique to you, because you are the only person, the only version of you that is going through that experience right now. So don't be afraid to show that off. I also talk about the sections that work for your experience. A lot of folks just look at a resume template and they're like, all right, cool. It says education, it says work experience. That's what I'm going to put in there. And they stop right there. You don't need to just stop at the sections that you see on a template. I'm going to give you some other suggestions of sections that might work later, but go back to what you think your most relevant skills and experience are, and then find a way to put it on your resume. If you're struggling to do that, a career counselor can absolutely help out with that. And then we talk about writing bullets that speak to your actual job or speak to the job that you're applying for, the work that you are aspiring to do. We're going to go really in depth as to how to create a compelling bullet point, but it is up to you to make that convincing argument to the person who's going to be reading this document. When we talk about this concept of making your document easy to absorb, I mean this in a couple of different ways. So one of the places where people often trip up is when they're creating their resume, they start off with a template. If you go onto Word or Google Docs or even Pages, there's so many templates that are out there, and your instinct is going to be like, well, these are massive computer programs, they probably know what they're doing. I'm going to pick one of these templates. But templates come with a couple of drawbacks. The first, if anybody has ever used the template before, I don't know if you want to use the React thing to show if you've tried to use the template, and you don't even have to say that you've used it, has it been easy to work with? And I can say basically across the board, everybody I know who's tried to use a template before has been so frustrated while trying to format it. It's just weird and they're quirky and they have like hidden spaces hidden in them and stuff like that. They're hard to work with. The second problem I have with templates is that they're going to cause you to blend in. It's going to be harder for you to stand out because other people are going to be using that same template. That's no good. We don't want that either. But the third problem I have with templates, and this is the worst one, the templates aren't even good. If you were to go and just pull out one, like a Google Doc template or something like that, it's not going to be the most effective way to present your information. A lot of times they break a lot of the guidelines and a lot of the rules that you've heard before because they're just not necessarily made by people who read resumes frequently. And I want you to start thinking about like, hey, just because Google says that this is good doesn't necessarily mean it is, or just because Word says it is doesn't mean it is. Starting with a template is sometimes a good way for you to start writing, but I would encourage you to move out of that template as early as possible. You can also use a lot of little tricks to start establishing patterns to make it easier to pull your information out. We'll go into that in a little bit more depth, and we'll talk about some of those tricks as well. So let's dig into what I mean by relevance. I mentioned earlier that while using the sections that are provided on resume templates is helpful and it's a good starting point, it's not always going to work for your personal experience. So I highlighted a couple of customized sections that I've worked with students before and kind of created off the cuff. Really common one that you do see show up is this idea of talking about your relevant coursework. But maybe you even do this a little bit more differently, and you do highlighted coursework. Instead of just going through and naming off classes that you've taken, like you'd often see in a relevant coursework section, maybe you pick one or two lab classes you've had. And instead of just talking about them by saying the name of it, you go into depth on it like you might one of your experience sections. You're allowed to do that. You're allowed to do basically anything with your resume, as long as you're being honest about it. But you want to have that focus be showing off that relevant information. So don't be afraid to highlight some of or take advantage of some of that flexibility to highlight your experience. I've often seen people put a leadership experience category on a resume, which is great, but leadership experience isn't just a place where you were the team captain or the place where you were the president. You could be a standard member of a club, but be the person who welcomes people, be the person who always shows up at events and helps set up. There are so many ways to be a leader. You can be a leader by being involved in your community. You can be a leader by volunteering. This is a very broad category potentially where you can include this as a catch-all for a lot of different kinds of experiences. You might focus on, instead of just having a generic experience category or work experience category, changing the name of it. So if you're a psychology major, instead of just saying experience and then talking about the jobs that you've held, what if you said psychology experience? And then it starts tapping into, well, actually, I guess I could put my TA experience because that's tied into psychology. And, oh, I did actually attend a couple of these training seminars in order to specialize on this one aspect of research. And when you start broadening the definition of experience and customizing these categories, it's sort of giving you permission to talk more about the things that might be most relevant. I also threw in these last two, projects and skills. Almost everybody by the end of their college career has completed a number of projects, and everybody at the end of their college career has developed skills. These are sections that can help you take some of those things that you've done inside of a classroom, make it really clear and explicit that they are classroom experiences, but let you go into some greater depth about each of those, some things to think about. It also bums me out, and this is why I have a misconception section in here, when people think that they're not allowed to put something on their resume. If your experience is relevant and you can kind of give it some level of tangibility, like you've acted inside of it, you can absolutely talk about it on your resume. So the first misconception that people often have is that you can't put an experience on there if you didn't get paid to do it. Ridiculous. Volunteering experience can totally go on here. Unpaid experience, shadowing that you've done, all of these things count as potential experiences you could put on a resume, as long as they are relevant. I also often hear that if you did an experience in high school, you must take it off of your resume, and that is not true. I work with a lot of students who are in Stockbridge, and many of those students have gone to high schools that specialized in their field of study. The idea of them taking that experience off of their resume does not make sense. So if you have relevant experiences, if you did an internship when you were in high school, you can absolutely put it on there if it is relevant. If it makes sense, it's relevant, get it on there. And then often we encourage people to put their most recent experiences first. And that is usually a good idea. Usually the stuff you're doing more recently is more relevant, but I don't want that to be the end all be all rule that you follow. There's often really good reasons why you might take an experience that you maybe did last summer and put it above the work study experience that you're doing right now. You can get creative with how to shift that around too. Maybe you create a section that focuses on something like your major experience and that allows you to move that internship experience up higher. But be creative. Don't be afraid to flex out of what you think might be the standards for a resume. So let's keep going. There we go. If you're thinking about inspiration for what you might want to write on your resume, what I like asking folks to do is reflect on their own experiences, and not necessarily just what you've done in a classroom, but I like to start off by asking questions like, what are you proud of? Or what has made you happy? Or what was something that was a major accomplishment that took a lot of effort. This can often be good inspiration for thinking about something that you didn't originally think belonged on your resume. But when you start thinking about it in the context of why you were proud of it or the work that you put into it, it might make sense to add it on there. I once worked with a student who, for the last 7 years, had been helping run a charity 5K run. And while that wasn't related directly to their major at all, it was something that they just did from a volunteer's perspective. They had moved up into a leadership role. They had taken on additional responsibilities. They were helping manage the project and contact clients. Despite it being just something that they did as a side project to help out a cause that they really cared about, it absolutely made sense for them to put that on their resume. So don't be afraid to think outside the box as to what might belong on here. If you are creating your resume and the thought that you're having is, I wish I had this experience, or I wish I had that one, or I wish I had that one, don't worry about that. We're all in progress on our careers, developing our experience out there. So if you don't have it right now, that's perfectly okay, but you should be strategizing how you can go and fill in that blank for the next time you're going to be working on that document. So maybe this means reflecting on the clubs or organizations that you're already a part of and thinking how to take on a larger leadership role in them. Maybe it means that if you really want to do a research experience and you're a sophomore, well, find ways that you can get involved or know professors or reach out more now. So the next time that you go to create your resume, you'll have that experience under your belt. So I mentioned this idea of writing bullet points to help show off relevance. A lot of folks who are creating their bullet points, and this is often what you'll see on a resume template, is that you just see bullet points that list out what people did at work, sort of what you would see in a job description, like I work the cash register, I do this, I do that. There's nothing wrong with that, but you're losing an important aspect of what a resume can be, which is something that connects your experience to the job that you're applying for. So rather than just writing down your responsibilities, I usually recommend people go through this exercise. This is something that I developed a couple of years ago, and I think it might be helpful for folks who might be worried that they're not a good writer. Resumes don't require you to be a good writer or a creative writer. They just require you to be able to reflect on your own experience and talk about it in a way that people can understand and connect with. So the first step to writing a good bullet point. For anybody who's ever watched Mean Girls, one of my favorite movies, I call this the word vomit section, okay? This is where you just take all of your experiences and you get it down on the page as much as you can. Usually I find it's helpful to do this with like a friend or a family member or something like that. And what you do is you start talking about your experience, and then you have that family member say, and then what? And you just keep doing that until you have a lot of stuff written down. So right now on the screen, you can see I only have like a couple of lines written. When I actually do this, we should have like half a page written out, as much as you can, even if it feels like it's not important. We're not editing right now. This is going to be the building blocks that we use to construct our bullet point. If you do this in a lot of detail, if you get a lot of information out, it's going to make everything else you do afterwards that much easier. So that's a good way to think about it. So number one, word vomit, get your stuff down. Number two is you start grouping similar activities together based off of skills that you might want to show off. So I was using a camp counselor as my example here, as I'm sure you probably figured out. And this person, this hypothetical person that I've created their resume for, they want to show off their ability around what they do with management, something around like helping people, running groups, like that kind of thing. And so this idea of like running activities and doing arts and crafts were so similar that it felt right to group them together, depending on the kind of skill that they might want to show off. The way that we figure out what skill we want to show off is typically by picking a good starting verb. Now, good verbs are not fancy verbs. Another common thing that I see folks do is that they're like, I've got a word on here. I want it to be a better word. I'm going to right click on it. I'm going to go to thesaurus, and I'm just going to pick a word that sounds fancier. And fancy words are not what we're looking for. Typically, I want my verbs to be specific, measurable, and or observable. Those three words tend to be a good measure if a verb is more or less effective. The more of those boxes it checks off, the more effective it tends to be. So if I was going to pick the word help, help is not a very effective verb. When you think about specific, well, there's a lot of different ways that you can help people. You can help people with their homework. You can help people across the street. You can save somebody's life by helping them with CPR. So help isn't very specific. It's also not observable. I can envision those more specific things that I just said, like helping somebody across the street. by giving some detail around it, but just the idea of envisioning helping somebody, we'd all be picturing something a little bit different. And it's also hard to measure helping. What does the measure of help actually look like? Help feels like it might be a good word, but it's actually not that strong or not as effective as it could be. Now, counter that to a word like throw. On its surface, the verb throw, like throwing a baseball or something like that, doesn't feel like that strong of a verb, but it's very specific. It's very observable. You can absolutely measure throwing as well. So while throwing might not feel like it's particularly strong, if it was relevant for a job, it could really work for us. So depending on what skill you want to show off, I want you to find a specific, observable, and or measurable version of that verb to show off that skill. Now, sometimes you can't check off any of those boxes. Sometimes help is the absolute right word to use, and that's okay, but you should be evaluating your resume, going through and seeing if you can get to that greater level of specificity. And then once you have your strong starting verb, you just go through and start asking yourself questions about that verb. And then the answers that you give that would be interesting or relevant to the person reading it, you'll write that down. I gotta tell you, this takes a little bit of time in order to be able to write out your bullet points, but I have never seen it not work. It works every single time for helping somebody create bullet points that are easier to connect and easier for people to relate to when they're reading your document. I'd really recommend this as an exercise, especially if you're feeling like you don't know what to say. All right. If you're wondering what strong verbs might look like, I wanted to give you a couple of examples. And again, some of these don't check off all three of my boxes of specific, observable, and measurable, but you'll often see that at least some of them do. Some of them get us to a greater level of detail. So I want you to start thinking about your verbs in that way, ways that you can make it easier for people to envision, ways that you can make it easier for people to understand and measure that sort of thing. And then it will become much more easier for you to supplement that with other details. If you're struggling to think about what information you might want to write, I find that going into job descriptions can be pretty helpful. So find something that you think that you might want to do, and then start looking for what we call the KSAOs. So KSAO is knowledge, skills, abilities, and other traits that this employer might be looking for. When you see things like solve quantitative problems or interpret scientific data, these might be good hints as to where you do have skills that are related to the job. And once you find those things, you can go and start tying them into your own document and making that comparison, making that connection for a potential employer that much easier to make between you and the job that you're applying for. So that was relevance. Relevance is a little bit high level to think about, but it has a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of right ways to do relevance. And so I want you to find the thing that works best for you. Easy to absorb is a little bit easier to teach. It's a little bit easier for us to grasp onto because there are some tactical things that we can do to make a document easier to absorb, more accessible for the reader. So I'm going to show you this resume. I'm going to leave it up for about 30 seconds or a minute, and I'd love for you to give it a quick glance. And if you could in the chat, just jot down a couple of things that you feel like might not be as effective, that might be making this a little bit harder to absorb. So anything that you see that you think might not be working for you. Good. I have a couple things coming in here. So somebody brought up the spacing. I agree completely. Now there's a couple different things with the spacing here, right? So my eyes immediately drew to this bottom right-hand corner where there's this huge empty blank space. Now having some blank space is okay, but it seems like the space is all over the place here, not really making anything easier to read. We have another message where somebody says inconsistent/inefficient spacing and fonts. Yes, so that inefficient spacing is what I was getting into. That's fantastic. I'm glad that you called that out. You can put spacing in, but this is all over the place. It's not really that efficient in its usage. And now the inconsistent fonts, here's the thing. This is a Google Drive templated resume. This is one that I just pulled off of the Google templates that you can just go and access. And so where I was saying they're not often effective resumes, this like tiny header that's blue shifting into a large different font description of Friendly's ice cream that then goes into gray bullet points, I can't think of a good reason to change that information around so much. It's exhausting. Somebody else also called out the differences in font. Yeah, it's just a bit too much. Somebody called out the inconsistent spelling of MA, so the state acronym for Massachusetts. I'm a big proponent of capital M, capital A for Massachusetts. And you can see up in this person's address, and then for their work experience, they do capital M, lowercase a, and then they shift over to capital M, capital A for city. It's just all over the place. That inconsistency really adds a level of unprofessionalism. Somebody mentioned here, you overlook the major categories like experience, education, and project because the color, the size, and the blandness of it. I am totally with you. We can even see down here, the very last thing listed on the resume, it might even be partially blocked off by Zoom for you, is a project in physics. And this person is a physics major. All that information is being obfuscated. What a bummer. Really ineffective. So I wanted to call out a couple of those things, but you folks got a good chunk of them. So we have things like coursework and other relevant experience being pushed down. That's not working. And these inconsistent lines, it's just a total mess and something that we don't need to live inside of. There's a lot of things that we can do to fix this up and make it a little bit more effective. So if you're looking for a way to tap into accessibility, what I usually mention to folks is that look for pattern recognition. Pattern recognition is usually the thing that's going to make your information more accessible. So I'm going to demonstrate how this can make a difference for you. There's a lot of kinds of pattern recognition that you can tap into, but I wanted to highlight 3 that this particular resume segment really needs. So I have order of information, lining up of information, and then formatting tools to get us into that pattern. So when I'm talking about order of information, if you look at this person's education and work experience, the first line in education is the category, and then the second line is a place, the California Institute of Technology, Caltech. When we get down to work experience, the first line is the category, just like education, work experience, but then the second line is like a job title, and the third line is the place. And that one little thing makes it that much harder, a little bit slower for people to read. So a really quick, easy way to fix this would be to switch those things around. And it doesn't matter what order you switch them in. You could put the chief research scientist first for work experience, but then you'd probably want to put your Bachelor of Science first as well. Since those are the primary focus things that you are doing at that time, they should be in kind of the same spot. Does that make sense? Yeah. Easy, small little thing to do, but it makes a big difference. So now that we have these things in order and an order that's a little bit more intuitive, we want to line up information to add in a little bit more consistency. So a lot of times fixing spacing is a vertical problem, like inconsistent spacing between sections or something. But here we have an inconsistency from left to right. There's a couple different ways we could fix this. We could tab over June a little bit more so it lines up with graduated. But in this case, I just push them all the way to the right. There's a little trick that I'll show you on how to do that, but it just goes and makes everything clean and inside of its own category. Already leaps and bounds more effective than what we had before. So then the last thing that I tend to do is see what formatting we can add in order to add some clarity in this. So look for places where information is blending a little bit, especially information that you wish would stand out. So right now, the fact that we're using all the same formatting for education, or the major header, education, the location, Caltech, and then the primary focus, the Bachelor of Science degree, that's slowing down my comprehension a little bit because it's hard to pick out each of those details. So especially for these major pieces of information, I want them to be formatted a little bit differently. So here I took the header and changed it to capitalized and bolded. There's nothing special about it being capitalized and bolded. If it was italicized or something, that would be totally fine too. If it was underlined, it's not about what formatting I picked. It was about having it be distinct to set up a pattern. And now it becomes a lot easier for me to pick out when a new major section is starting because it has something really distinct and in my face. And it's becoming easier to tell where those subsections are because those starting lines for each piece of information are bolded. Already, just with those 3 small changes, if we're going to compare these 2 things, they look a world different. My first instinct, actually, when I look down at the second one, the one that we made changes on, is that it seems shorter, even though they take up the same number of lines, it feels shorter. And a part of that is just because of that consistency. It feels shorter because I can read it more quickly. I'm going straight to California Institute of Technology. If Caltech is a thing that sticks in my brain as being important, I've already primed my brain to start looking for bold things, and it's going to look for other bold stuff as a result. If the thing that jumped out at my attention is the Bachelor of Science double major, then now I'm primed to look for that first line under bold stuff to see what's inside of there. That's where pattern recognition gets really effective. When you have a good pattern set up, people will read your resume more quickly, and not just read it more quickly and get through it, they'll be able to absorb and comprehend the information that's inside of it. It's reading quickly with comprehension that makes this effective. There's another great side benefit of pattern recognition, and that's knowing when we can break the pattern. So once we set up that pattern recognition, people are moving through our resume, they're reading it quickly. But if we want to highlight a small detail that we think might be important, we can go and break that pattern up a little bit and draw special attention to it. Now, we don't want to do this a lot. If you're breaking up the pattern all the time, then we don't have a pattern, right? But we can do it every once in a while to have a piece of information stick out. So I'm wondering, while folks were reading this, what piece of information broke the pattern? What was the thing that broke away from what we were doing before? Can anybody toss that into the chat? I know it's a little bit weird, right? I don't have anyone in here, so I'm going to go and move it forward because I want to make good use of our time. Countdown 3, 2, 1. Boom. We have this GPA hanging out in here. And so this person has an incredibly high GPA. They did a really good job with that. So by breaking that pattern, we have this one piece of information that's not following the mold, and it's going to be easier for that information to stick out. Now, if you wanted somebody to really notice your GPA, this is a good way to do that. If you want it to be more subtle, maybe you give it its own line or a bullet point or put it next to your degree or something like that. But we can break up our pattern by throwing out information like that too and having people pick out that detail. All right. My last couple of tricks around formatting stuff. So I'm going to give you 4 tricks that I find to be incredibly helpful. I'm going to move through them quickly. You can Google for examples, or you can meet with somebody in the office to see what we're talking about here. But these 4 things tend to be the thing that helps you fix up your formatting more than anything. So number 1, you might have seen that I did some writing on the right side of the screen when I was setting up the dates. What I used there was something called a right tab stop. Now you can Google to figure out how to do that on any document that you're trying to create, either Google Docs or Word or whatever. But usually the way that you create it is by clicking in the ruler that's at the top of the screen, and it'll create a little marker. In Google Docs, it's a little blue triangle. In Word, it's a little black arc, like a little right angle symbol. And if you double click on that, you can add in those settings. There's also a trick just to double click them in there. I can guarantee you it's going to make all your formatting look a lot more cleanly if you get, or a lot more clean if you get into the pattern of doing that. If you're using a document and you keep seeing automatic spacing shows up, it's usually one of 2 problems. It's either in the paragraph or line spacing settings. So again, you can Google, depending on your own independent word processing software, to figure out where these are. Line spacing is the thing that makes it look like the text is just generally stretched out because there's just a slightly longer space. When you go to double space a paper, you're doing that in the line spacing settings. But sometimes the line spacing settings, instead of being 2, which is double space, will be like 1.15, or it just looks a little bit bigger. If you want to condense that stuff down, you can do it there. If every time you press enter, it automatically creates a big indent, that's paragraph spacing. And so resetting those things to 0 will make it so that things condense a little bit more. Always get questions about what font or format or size is best. The only thing that we need to think about is this readable, and is it consistent in the way that we're using it? If it's readable and consistent, it's usually pretty good. And readable, like, don't get me wrong, Papyrus and Comic Sans, those are readable fonts, but they are harder to read. They will slow down people's reading comprehension. So they're not bad because they look weird. They're bad because they slow down comprehension, and we want to move away from that. The last thing is, I often see people write paragraphs for describing their experiences rather than using bullet points. Like I said, I don't have bullet points as a rule. That's not one of those things where like you gotta write them, you can't do those paragraphs. But typically bullet points are gonna help bring your skills, those verbs, up to the beginning of the sentence and make it easy for people to scan those skills out, figure out where your skills are. They also make it so that instead of writing a big block of text, which people tend to skip past, if you're writing just a line of information, or maybe even 2 lines of information per bullet point, people are more likely to read more of that information. So you don't have to do it, but it does tend to expedite people's reading and their ability to pull out what your skills are. All right, so thank you for joining me for this session. I'm going to be wrapping things up right now, but I did want to highlight that we are doing one more of these sophomore career series presentations. It's going to be on January 18th. And we're going to be talking about internship hunting. So if you're thinking about looking for an internship, January is a wonderful time to start thinking about what you're going to be doing over the course of the summer. I encourage you to join us. So if you have any questions, please feel free to toss them into the chat. I'm also going to unlock microphones in case people want to ask any questions. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions? I'm actually going to stop the recording too, because people tend not to like talking while the recording's going.